everyone. Welcome to A Little Waywards, where we do little very well.
We do little well.
Yeah, we do little well.
Case in point.
Case in point. Yeah, I just messed up the first line of the podcast.
That's
Anyways,
all right.
This is a podcast for those of you tuning in for the first time, coming out of St. Therese Institute. It's a new venture that we're getting on. My name is Nick.
And I'm Jim.
Welcome to this third episode of the show. We're releasing this podcast just after Easter. We're filming it before just to kind of get it a bit of the head of the curve with all of our busyness and everything else coming up. So I guess one of the things...
So how was your Easter, Nick?
How was my Easter? Well, I anticipate that it's going to be very restful. Denise and I are planning to hand off rosé to each other on a few mornings. I sleep in 2 mornings. She sleeps in 2 mornings.
It's a lateral pass, is it?
Yeah. I think that's the idea, or a nocturnal pass.
Nocturnal
I'm not
pass.
sure. And how about you, Jim? How do you anticipate your Easter is going to be this year?
Well, it's kind of a funny thing to be realizing the show is coming out after Easter, but here we are. That's Holy Wednesday, or Easter Wednesday coming up, but here we are on Holy Wednesday, so maybe experiencing a bit of the timelessness of God. So I'm anticipating that it's going to be a very different Easter, and I think I can say with conviction at the point that this is being broadcast that, it has been a strange Easter. I'm just resting in those words that we've so often repeated here. Christ is alive. He is our hope. And that resurrection is a timeless moment. So I can actually anticipate that very deeply now and know that that's a space you're going to be growing in. It's going to be different, not being able to celebrate the Eucharist, not being able to gather in a worshiping community, but also recognizing that though we're not able to physically gather, the physical presence of Christ is present on this earth, and it is the tie that binds. It's the source of our unity. So I think I'm going to be living that very deeply.
No, and sorry, some in my throat. We were joking about hairballs earlier for some reason. Now I guess I have one. But Denise and I we're feeling something similar. For me, what I constantly am thinking about is thinking of like those early pilgrims and early settlers of Canada and like of America, where like you'd have a family literally going into the wilderness or something like that, little house in the prairie kind of thing, and their Easter or their Christmas would just be spent with each other, and there would be very little social contact, no telephones, no nothing like that. So for me, what I'm getting a sense of is, yes, a sense of solidarity with the church in this time, but I think, the timelessness across all the generations is kind of something that's in the back of my mind. So if for my wife and I, like, we love our in-laws, we love our family, and so this is a bit difficult for both of us kind of coming up on this weekend where it's just going to be us, but it's also going to be a lovely opportunity for setting some family traditions, Easter Sunday waffles, and thank God we have the ability to have waffles, and
in the morning.
And in the morning, that's right. No fast until the Mass. That's right. So it's going to be a different Easter, but I'm anticipating that there's going to be a lot of lessons learned as a family for us.
I can see that. I can anticipate that too. I think simplicity is going to be one of the overarching themes. It certainly has been. Simplicity, poverty in different forms, littleness. I think it really is a return to what we speak about, that return to Nazareth, back to the essentials, which leads us to the main thing.
Yeah, so the topic of the day today is maybe an unofficial title that we have here is Choices, Choices, Choices. I choose all? Question mark?
That was a question that came up in conversation with one of the students, Dean Ham. He was asking, he said, how do you handle actually discerning all of the choices, the things that are all available to you now in this time of isolation where there is so much that seems we're cut off from, and yet so much that is readily available in the social media, online, all of these incredibly good offerings. It's like a Catholic smorgasbord. So choices, choices, choices. How do you choose? The image that came to my mind is that story of St. Therese when presented with that basket of dolls by her sister, asked to pick one, and St. Therese said, I choose all. We have to almost be a little bit un-Therese in this one. It's like choices, choices, choices. I don't choose all. I can't choose all. So the question is, how do we choose? I don't know. You have any thoughts on what would you choose? What kind of stuff are you leaning into in this time?
Oh, that's a good question, Jim. It's one that I've actually been kind of coming to grips with very practically in the last few days. It's only a short time ago since we filmed recorded our podcast on leisure, actually. And one of the big things that I had in kind of looking up some resources for that podcast was just coming to realize it's very hard to have leisure in your life when you have so many options up and around. So for me, it's been this constant process of just like trying to take advantage of some of the amazing resources coming out in this time, but sometimes finding that comes at the cost of my leisure, the cost of my contemplation. We need to be careful that this overactive busybody image of man, or humanity, I would argue, doesn't interfere with our spiritual life and, frankly, with our sanity as well. So I find myself just really asking myself questions about what is objectively or universally good for me as a human being to do in this time period. So like, what are some good resources? And now that in the Catholic sphere, in the time of the new evangelization, this doesn't exactly narrow it down. There's too many good resources coming out. You've got like the TOB Institute, Theology of the Body Institute. You've got Word on Fire. You've got, I guess now this podcast coming out.
We could be working ourselves out of an audience here, couldn't we?
Yeah. I guess the humble thing to say would be if we worked ourselves out in an audience, but they all ended up right where they're supposed to be, then
it's perfect.
We have to be content with that.
Yeah.
So you'll have our permission to stop listening right now.
Or to invite others to listen as well.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So I find for myself, like, just asking the objective question is good and all, but I also find myself asking myself the subjective question, is this good for me?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what's been carrying me through a bit.
Yeah. And I think you're right. It's a matter of discernment. Ultimately, this is a matter of discernment. It's not just random choices or choices based on a whim. I think we have to be discerning. And I think there are some structure of discernment that we can use. We can carry over some of the Ignatian principles of discernment, or just the way that we make good choices into what I'm choosing to feed myself at this time. But I think your point about it being subjective is important, because objectively, this is a happy problem. There are so many things that are readily available to us that are all good, true, and beautiful. It really is like a Catholic buffet, a Catholic smorgasbord. So maybe, subjectively speaking, maybe. This is one of the times where you can afford to be a cafeteria Catholic.
Oh dear, we're going to get into some hot water maybe.
Yeah, well, the thing is, you can't afford to be a cafeteria Catholic when it comes to the essentials. And there are essentials. That's the objective that you're speaking of. But I think we can afford to be when it's, what is going to be appealing to my subjective tastes, but how do I discern those tastes? I think there's probably some principles that we could lean into on that, of how do I choose.
Yeah, no, I think that's very wise. One thing I have a question for you, Jim, and I think you're someone perfect to kind of answer this question, because you talk with the students about it all the time, is we say the word discernment. What does that word even mean?
Oh, sure, yeah. The word itself literally means to separate away. And really that's what we are doing in discerning, is we're saying, not this, so we can come to, yes, this. There's a phrase that was expressed by Christopher West, which I thought was really, really beautiful, and he's applying it theology to the body. It applies to every aspect of our life, is that, our yes means nothing if we can't say no. So discernment is actually being able to say, all right, what do I say no to? But more importantly, what do I say no to? One of the images I use for discernment is the beautiful story about Michelangelo, who had the ability to look at a block of marble and was able to see the statue that needed to be carved. It's like his innate sense. Talk about a charism of craftsmanship. He was able to see that. So somebody once asked him, how did he carve David, the statue David? And he said, I simply went to the block of marble and chipped away everything that was not David. And I think that's a beautiful example of what discernment is. It's chipping away everything that is not God's will, if we're discerning God's will. It's chipping away everything that's not the duty of the moment, if it's a matter of discerning the duty of the moment. It's chipping away all that is not what I should be feeding on right now, my daily bread, the manna in the desert that God is sending my way. So what resources for ongoing formation and enrichment in this time? It may seem a little bit laborious to be constantly discerning, and certainly for a while it is a discipline and it requires some practice, but rather like riding a bike. Once you learn the skill, it becomes actually second nature to you and also a means of freedom.
Yeah, and when you first begin riding a bike, there's all sorts of nicks and bruises and unexpected gullies you
Sure.
lodge your front tire in. I remember when I was a kid, I was going through a field and all of a sudden the front of my bicycle went down and I went flying over it, and then right into a rose bush, and that was a lot of fun. And I think that my experience with discerning things, especially when there's so many options, is something similar. It comes down to a bit of trial and error, especially in the beginning. After a while, I think you can kind of find out what resonates and what is consonant with what your vocation is, your state of life, and all the rest. And maybe those are some categories we can talk about here that are factors in your discernment. But you even mentioned another one, which is interesting, charism. I think this all gets down to your person. As John Paul II says, each human being is properly an individual, is properly a personality. And so for myself, it's really come down to, as you say, using Ignatian spirituality a lot to just sort of determine my path. And it's interesting to know, like Ignatian spirituality, it's really just about trying to promote holy indifference, which is this notion of, say you're standing on a fence and on one end is one option, on the other end is another, and they're both perfectly good objective options. It's not about whether one's a sin and one's, this other good thing. It's about, these are two perfectly good things. Do I listen to the Word on Fire podcast or the St. Therese podcast? Well, I would say, I'm just kidding. Yeah. But, you're standing on the fence and these are two perfectly amazing things, if I might be so bold. But holy indifference for Ignatian spirituality is really just saying to the Lord, Lord, push me in the direction you want me to go. Let him be the wind.
So there's an element of docility in that too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Now I think there's a couple of things that are primary to that, which are good at least acknowledging. And that's first off that this is all within the context of recognizing the universal call to grow in holiness, which really is about growing and being human.
Yeah.
So there's this fundamental human element to it. The first level of discernment is not even discernment, it's just avoiding the occasion of sin. That which is not reflective of the true, the good, and the beautiful, we don't choose those things. Discerning what is true, good, and beautiful, and how those are helpful in me fulfilling my first vocation, which is the vocation to grow in holiness, to honor and love and serve God in this life and be with Him in the next, and really be present with Him in this life and present with Him in the next, is key. So there's those objective structures. But as you point out, then it's a matter of discernment between all of these good things. And this is where some of that personal principles would come in. So one of the first ones I would suggest would be, what has the Lord been doing with you? What's the path that you have been on so far? And that can be looked at, looking at some of those things that have fed you in the past. Well, maybe be leaning in that direction. The discernment of charisms. You're mentioning charisms. I mentioned charisms. Then you mentioned charisms, and I'm mentioning them again. But yeah, it's like that.
Mentioned 3 times.
3 times, 4 times. So that the key on that then is if these are gifts that are given by God to serve others, then why not feed in those areas? I'm using the term feed because I think it really is about that feeding, that growing strength, that nourishing, and the training and the equipping. So, what are the charisms that you have discerned in your life? And then be working on strengthening those areas and having good formation. Which begs the question then, does everything that you are leaning into in this time, making the choices for what you're going to watch, what you're going to, the resources you turn to, do they have to be overtly Catholic?
It's funny you say that, Jim, because just the other day, here's 2 examples. Usually whenever I go out on a drive, I listen to a podcast, usually something from the Word on Fire Institute. There's a history of philosophy podcast I occasionally tune into. There's a few other secular podcasts which I find very fascinating, very informational.
You don't re-listen to us?
Well, I haven't had the opportunity to yet. I don't really like listening to my own voice.
It's a bit like somebody once described it as drinking your own bathwater.
Yeah. It does feel like that. All the little pieces of lint in there, and goodness knows what else.
Anyhow, with that mental image, I'm sorry, you were saying?
Yeah, no, that's totally derailed me. Gosh.
So how is Rosé?
Drinking your own bathwater. Yeah, it's a little gross. Kids are awesome. Lots of fun and humor. But yeah, what was I saying? Oh yeah, there's two instances. Like usually whenever I go on a walk or out going for like a drive or something like that, I usually plug in a podcast or I plug in a lecture or something like that. I think I've discerned something of a charism of knowledge, so I gain life in studying and such, but I also tend to give life to the church in studying. But sometimes I get a little exhausted in that, and it really robs me from this notion of having a contemplative gaze upon the Lord in this. It's not leisurely. My mind is too busy. This turns away from being something sought for its own sake of just, the liberation of my mind, the liberation of my heart and soul, and into this very servile notion of, I got to learn this for this other thing.
Becomes very utilitarian in that
very
way.
utilitarian.
Yeah.
So the other day, I went out for a long walk, 45 minutes to an hour, and I didn't listen to a thing. And I was very intentional about just looking at everything. And it's amazing what you find. I think it was the exact concept of what you would call a wonder wander, is what you've called that before, Jim, where you just look at the world and you try and just appreciate it as it is, celebrating reality. Then the other day, I was driving, and Christian here at St. Therese had let me know about a podcast about board games. Now, I love board games. So I just decided, you know what, I'm just going to plug that in because I know that's something that's leisurely for me right now. So I plugged it in and had a blast, And so I did come to see something transcendental, good, beautiful, and true in there. Because objectively, it was all solid. It's fine. It's not like the highest echelons of being, that you're contemplating, but it is a good part of human creativity and hospitality and all the rest.
Sure.
But
personal interest. Areas of
course.
personal interest should be cultivated as well.
Oh yeah, no, that's totally true. So those were two things. I know that recently there was like a big online Catholic conference that was offered as well. And for me, that came on a weekend, and my vocation with my family is first. I'm afraid I didn't take in any of it. As much as I respected and really was amazed at the list of speakers they had come up for it, it was just something I couldn't get around to.
And how did you feel about that?
Not bad.
Good, good. I know in chatting, because it was exactly that conference that had come up, and I was speaking with somebody, and they said they were feeling some sense of guilt, that I should have been tuning into that. And I don't think we should be feeling guilty about saying a very real no to things. And you certainly give a very solid foundational principle for discernment is, what is my current situation? What is my current responsibilities, my vocation? So with Denise and Rosé on hand.
Yeah, my little family. We're trying to set up our own traditions. We're trying to have our own weekend. And sure, I could have squeezed something in there, but then I almost guarantee you I would have been distracted the entire weekend.
So it brings us back to some of those foundational principles of what is the duty of the moment.
So Jim, what is the duty of the moment?
Well, the duty of the moment is, again, something else to be discerned. But so much of the duty of the moment is coming from our discipline of life, and the discipline of life flowing from being a disciple. So listening to God, speaking through the circumstances of life. So first and foremost, is it good? Is it going to help me grow in holiness? Secondly, is it tying in with my vocational state, the vocation to growing in holiness, the vocation to my specific apostolate, what I'm doing, my state in life, married with a child, in a family context where there's responsibilities, and so I'm not neglecting those. But recognizing that there's also a duty of the moment for personal enrichment. There's a duty of the moment for some time of leisure, for pursuing pastimes, hobbies. I think what we can also have, if you're looking for that inner state, we can have a couple of extremes that we want to avoid. One would be, as you'd mentioned, about approaching things as strictly utilitarian, that I'm doing this just for that personal enrichment, and it's going to be what's good for me to use. Well, then I'm not actually allowing it to really saturate and integrate and become a part of me. I'm doing it for another reason. And now we're always going to be enriched. It's always going to pay forward. But I think we have to be careful about being strictly utilitarian on one end. And also boredom. I'd be very cautious about boredom, because boredom also is a hardness of heart, where I'm not allowing myself to really grow in that sense of wonder.
Mm-hmm.
What would you think duty of the moment? How would you describe that insofar as choices that we make?
Yeah, and this is one I can actually imagine there's some people who would be listening to this and feeling still an inner tension at this point. Do the moment, seeing what the next good you're being called to. I love the way Saint Therese of Lisieux puts it too. She calls it the sacrament of the moment. I think
place where we encounter God.
Exactly, the presence. It relates into, frankly, our previous 2 podcasts. We have this tendency to kind of weave all of these themes together, Jim. I've noticed this.
Yeah.
Everything we say tends to build off something else that we've done. So if you are ever confused about what we're saying in this podcast, go ahead and watch the other 2. Maybe it'll make more sense.
In context.
Maybe more context.
Because we are a little wayward.
We are a little wayward here. We do little well. But I don't know. For me, the duty of the moment, one thing that is maybe on my mind, but I can see it's in someone else's mind here, is sometimes there's a bit of an external pressure. Like there's a problem in your life that you feel like you have to solve. Or something like that.
Or like my life is a problem.
Yeah, my life is a problem, Yeah, and maybe sometimes it is. So maybe we should change it. But, for example, you're aware that, say, a situation is going to come up next week, and you're not exactly looking forward to it. It's your weekend, and you see that there's a podcast. Oh, that's particularly on that issue. You're like, oh, this could be a godsend. But then you're also desperately sensing the need for a break, or maybe even deeper than a break, actually the Lord's Day peace, this actual day of rest, So in this sense, what would you kind of answer to that?
Well, I think maybe it comes back to duty of the moment, not to overwork something. But I think we can misunderstand duty of the moment when we focus on duty, particularly with our Western mind, and again, tying into our previous conversation on leisure. We can be so utilitarian that we focus on duty as what needs to be done. Not recognizing that our primary duty, because human beings are always doing something, but our primary doing is to be, and to be in the presence of God and to rest with God. So the duty of the moment is to always be growing in holiness and attentive to the presence of God, and where is God in this, and what does love look like? And then out of that sense of being present to God and God being present to us, the way I often describe it in front of the Blessed Sacrament, we recognize the Blessed Sacrament is Jesus Christ, body, blood, soul, and divinity. So in the moment of our lives, are we truly present to it? Body, blood, soul, and humanity. Am I fully present? And that's that sense of integrity, integration, authenticity, those things that are so very important, that I am here. And Christ allows me to be fully integrated in the moment, so I'm encountering Him. So I do think that duty of the moment is extremely important in the choices that we make. And knowing that Jesus in His own life, we read in the Gospels, was constantly inviting His disciples to come, be with Him, follow Him. In fact, in the Gospel of John, the first question Jesus asks is, what are you looking for? To the disciples that were coming from John the Baptist. And to which they respond, we want to see where you're staying. So a little bit, maybe donkey. In the morning we can have waffles. Can I stay with you?
On Easter morning, yeah.
So I think it's that sense of our hearts are restless until they rest in Thee. It's that coming into the presence of God and being able to rest with God, seeing where Jesus is and wanting to be with Him. That's the duty of the moment. Where are we able to be with Jesus? So that we can be both Martha, who is doing what needs to be done in loving service, and Mary, who is sitting at the feet of Jesus. And this is the beauty of this life, this active contemplation and this contemplative activity, is that we are able to both be serving our brothers and sisters and being at the feet of the Lord at the same time, in the same place. And that's the essence of the duty of the moment. So from that place, then, we can start doing all good discernment, even into what podcasts I'm going to listen to, what shows, what conferences online I'm going to participate, what workshops I'm going to participate in. And then what appeals to you, what's of interest. If it's board games and just something that's going to be leisurely and hobby related, that's beautiful. Learning some music, that's beautiful. Maybe it is going to be some rich faith formation because, I'm learning more. I was just speaking with somebody recently that was really wanting to learn more about Ignatian Discernment. And so directing to some resources that are readily available on Ignatian Discernment. And clearly that's just something where the Holy Spirit has obviously really captivated this person and drawing them that way. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
Well, I'm almost wondering, Jim, for the sake of this podcast here, it might be good to outline some basic principles of Ignatian discernment. for just the sake of kind of looking at something. Like we can all see that a little bit of formation in this time, with a lot of extra free time, you could say, or spare time, I'm not sure how you would put it, on our hands is a good thing. It's a good thing to look at, to form ourselves a little more. But it's a matter of discerning what's good for you. One principle of Ignatian discernment that I found really helpful in this journey is God never sends discouragement. He always encourages. For St. Ignatius, discouragement is never from God, because it precisely takes the wind out of your sails in the pursuit of holiness. And I've always found that really good, because even if I'm listening to a podcast that, or like a talk that is, objectively fine to say, sometimes I find myself actually being dragged down for one reason or another. And, I might even, it's a curious thing. So at times what I've done is I've actually removed myself from that podcast, that particular conversation, that particular topic, and then I come back to it 2 or 3 years later and I find it encouraging. And so for me, what I've come to learn is that there are certain times and certain places for certain kinds of conversations and certain kinds of discussions. And if there's maybe like an area that you feel challenged by, and you're like, well, I'm supposed to embrace challenges as a Christian, like the cross and all the rest. Sometimes Christians with such a focus on the cross, and that's important, we can sometimes just crucify ourselves on any cross, That's what I find, but really it comes down to carrying your own. What's that lovely quote from the Carpenter movie we just recommended? The staircase, Mother Superior says to another nun, "Oh, Mary, get off the cross. We need the wood." I thought that was wonderful. It was beautiful, because we as Christians sometimes can...
The martyr complex.
The martyr complex is huge. And we can mistake discouragement as the cross, because discouragement is very closely connected to despair, which is actually excusing of the virtue of hope from ourselves.
And I think there's often, because we don't believe that you can be having difficulty and experience joy at the same time. We see those as in opposition, but we fail to recognize that joy is a gift from God. It's a fruit of the Holy Spirit, and human joy is caught up in that. So even in the most dire and difficult circumstances, we can experience joy. So I think it's a very important point that you make. St. Therese herself would say discouragement is never of God. You're speaking into that principle too of being able to really get a sense of, is this drawing me closer to God? Is this drawing me away from God? And I think that could also be re-articulated in, is this helping to become more authentically human? Or is this inhibiting that? And sometimes it's just that sense of, how am I feeling afterwards? It's a bit like you eat a couple of chocolate bars, tastes great at the time, but not so comfortable afterwards.
Yeah, when it comes up in conversation later. Yeah.
And so having the order and the structure of life, that's so important. And then within the time that's available and the time that's appropriate, being able to go to that Catholic buffet of offerings and take what appeals to you. You don't have to take it all. Like, you go to any buffet, if you eat everything there, you're going to get sick.
It's true.
The same thing with this. And it will be lost on you.
And like even whenever you go to that buffet and you have a perfectly healthy stomach to begin with, you only have so much room for that slice of cheesecake. Or you can't, you only can eat one. And then you have to go have some, maybe a cup of coffee, and then you have a little bit of a glass of wine or something like that. But if you have way too much,
So what are you looking forward to this Easter?
Man, I've just listed off quite a bit of what I'm hoping to do.
Cheesecake, coffee, and wine.
Cheesecake, coffee, wine, cream in my coffee. Oh my gosh, that's been one of the biggest crosses this Lent.
There you go.
Yep.
So what appeals to the taste? What appeals to the flavor? And maybe you make an interesting point too. There is a time for fasting and a time for feasting. The time that we may have on our hands and available to us now can be seen as a problem. It can also be seen as a great opportunity. I mentioned earlier the idea doesn't have to necessarily be overtly Catholic, and I would say absolutely not. As you were mentioning that board game, that could be a beautiful thing for leisure. But also looking at some of those charisms that you have, those things that frankly bring you a lot of life. It's, maybe you're cooking. I was chatting with a friend that in these days is actually in a sense being forced to cook. I have another friend who loves cooking, and what an opportunity now to look at some podcasts or some resources that might actually teach teach cooking or new recipes. That's beautiful, and what a grace to be able to share that with others. Learning music, learning art. Maybe there's been something that's been a skill that's been wanting to learn, and that's about becoming greater, more human. If it is authentically a charism, then it's also going to be translated into some beautiful offering that is going to edify those around you. And that can also be an indication. So somebody with a gift of knowledge, I know how often, Nick, we've had conversations, and it's something that you've read that you've brought into the conversation, and your enthusiasm is palpable. It's so real and so manifest. And I find myself becoming drawn into that enthusiasm as well. And so I can see that that's a paying forward of the fruit of contemplation of knowledge and wisdom. And I get caught up in that. So there's a richness that comes from that. So thanks for that.
Oh, no problem. And I appreciate your charism of moderation. I'm just kidding. I'm not even sure if that's a charism. Maybe some people are charismatically moderate. I'm not sure. I think that it comes down to what is feeding you and what is giving you life. And I can almost hear an objection maybe that kind of comes around in the middle of this conversation, and maybe towards the end of it. We're going to be wrapping up this soon. But, what's the difference between perhaps developing yourself in a healthy manner, enjoying leisure, enjoying contemplation, and doing a certain amount of rigorous discursive formation discipline, and creating excuses for yourself and being a bit lazy and soft. It's almost like there's I appreciate a good, healthy, strong, masculine, muscular. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. Catholicism, but you can almost imagine an objection coming from that quarter. What would you kind of answer that with?
I would think balance. Balance. Nothing in excess, and the whole thing discerned and made incarnate, like actually given flesh within the context of structure, a way of life and discipline. So in that, there's got to be balance. I think that we are in danger of becoming a bit worldly in our way of approaching things with this binge mentality. Of I've got the time, well, I better stock up now. I think there can be a wisdom that is taught to us by Jesus, Jesus, to give us this day our daily bread, but by the people of Israel in the desert, is collect for yourself enough for today. So I think we have to be really careful, especially with something like Netflix. Movies are a weakness for me. I love movies, and it's so easy to get caught and drawn, and then the time is gone, and I'm not being mindful. So good to have some, not good to glut, and I think that there
Don't
can be...
collect your mana for the next days, because it's going to be worm-ridden.
Yeah, and I think that, it can be worm-ridden. And I think that may be an element of where, even in a good thing that is objectively good, too much of it all at once can leave me in a place of feeling discouraged, particularly if it ends up being in competition with other things that are essential to my life, whether it's, vocation, marriage and family, or the vocation of being a part of a family or of a community, the vocation to holiness. If it's distracting from my ability to pray, well, I really can't pray right now, Lord, because I need to be listening to you. It's like that example of the theologians going to two doors, heaven, lecture on heaven. I'll go to the lecture if it's like, I think you've missed the duty of the moment here,
Oh my gosh, it's too relatable. It's like, I want to know what I'm getting into first, It turns out the lecture on heaven is given by the devil.
Yeah. And maybe that's a key thing too, is let's not forget that in discernment, there is somebody else who wants to help us discern, and that is God. So just being attentive and asking and allowing ourselves to be sensitive to the voice of the Holy Spirit. And there are times to be with Jesus at Bethany, kicking up in his good friend's house and having some olives and whatever Lazarus would have provided. And then there's times to be in the desert.
No, I think that's so important, just to realize that Jesus Christ himself took leisure. He took time. And if you think about it, Jesus Christ's humanity and his divinity, his humanity would have, he could have spent all its time contemplating his divinity and all the rest. I'm not going to get too far into the hypostatic union here for a minute. It's just high theology. But he took time to be with the people he loved. He took time to go off and contemplate. He took time to enjoy things with people. you know. And so if we have, there can be this Catholic guilt that can kind of come about from this. And I think it's very wise what you've put forward.
The key is to be human. I've kind of thrown out some general ideas and notions, but maybe we can actually get practical as we move into our movie discussion. But how do we actually discern what movies we suggest here, Nick? It's kind of funny. We toss these ideas around. And I think we'd certainly be open to some suggestions if folks wanted to suggest what they had. But how have we come up with these movies? Like there's The Staircase, Groundhog Day.
Of course.
The Passion of the Christ.
Couldn't forget that
That was
one.
kind of an obvious one given the time that we're in. And there's another one that we're going to be rolling out now. But what are some of the tools that we use for discerning even movie? And maybe more broadly, how can we use these tools for discerning what movies we might view on our own?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think actually to an extent this is still a conversation that's unfolding between you and I, Jim, as well as this podcast. My instinct is that, I think that you and I are pretty much just going to watch a movie every week and try and make it maybe something available to everybody. But really, I think what we're trying to suggest are movies that would look really good on your bookshelf, or not
your virtual bookshelf.
Your virtual bookshelf. Your Google library, if you will.
Yeah.
I think that's the idea. I think that's going to be our aim. So, for example, The Staircase is something really good to have on your virtual bookshelf. Mm-hmm. I would say, Groundhog Day, The Passion, of course. What a beautiful Catholic film. And with any movie I think that we're going to try and suggest here, I think that it would be much like I recommend someone reading a book. I'm going to try and recommend something that I think would be good to have, So I think that's probably one good principle that we're going to do. So if it's not always available for free, what we're going to be talking about, I think that we'll try and make it something that would be enjoyable to have on there. Now, it doesn't mean you always have to agree with our movie choices. I know during the program, Jim, you sometimes launch out Nacho Libre. Nacho Libre.
Not everybody's cup of enchilada.
It's I've never seen a movie so divisive in terms of the amount of different kinds of
What about
conversations.
Bob? But anyway, we won't go there.
That one too. What about Bob? Yeah. But I think that, you can certainly disagree with us on our movie choices for the week. But we're going to try and make it meaningful, I think. Are there any kinds of movies that we usually won't discuss, Jim?
Well, I think there's going to be somewhere we'll want to be sensitive to the fact that not everybody's going to be viewing it on their own. They may be in the context of family, so we want to be careful that we are suggesting movies which are not necessarily of a nature that it would be inappropriate for all audiences. So we want to be sensitive to that. That there may be exceptions to that occasionally. So we're not necessarily going to be going with kids' films unless, we mentioned like Megamind or The Incredibles or Up. Those are great movies and certainly
awesome
family
movies,
films. But I also want to be recognizing that not all art is necessarily nice. There can sometimes be things which are very raw, very real. So in a film, there's sometimes be some aspects of language or some scenes where there's a bit of inhumanity that's happening, but it's part of the authentic storytelling and crafting that's happening. That being said, there are many movies that I think are excellent, excellent movies that we might not suggest in this context. Certainly in the context of St. Therese, not every movie that I have on my personal shelf would necessarily make it into the community because I want to be sensitive to each individual's sensitivities, and some people, frankly, are more sensitive to things than others, so we want to be cautious on that. So I think in the context of our movie choices, we're trying to suggest things that are thematically resonate. They're thematically resonant with what is authentically human. Aspects of the gospel, not necessarily overtly Christian, but having those underlying themes. I think Groundhog Day would be a good example of that.
Oh, yeah. If we're talking about like a Catholic sacramental imagination, we're thinking universal, sacramental. There's this notion of the true, the good, and the beautiful being in there as part of the logos of Jesus Christ, like the logos, the ordering principle of the cosmos. So anything that even participates in a non-explicit manner in that true and good and beautiful, as John Henry Newman would say and Justin Martyr, belongs to the gospel in some way.
Well, maybe we can bring the conversation then very clearly to the gospel that we just viewed in this past, since the last episode, the Passion of the Christ. We would say this is the very center of our faith, that still point in the turning world, as C.S. Lewis or as T.S. Eliot would describe it, Christ on the cross, which at first glance would seem brutal and almost ugly, and yet we recognize that there is truth, goodness, and beauty, and certainly the Passion of the Christ is a brutal film.
Oh my gosh, yeah. No,
So,
it's
in the context of everything we said, how did it make it on the list?
well, in a certain sense, if you're complaining about us putting out the Passion of the Christ, then you're almost complaining about what Christ went through. So, I mean, I don't have much more to say on that. But I think what happened in the Passion of the Christ is it just beautifully demonstrates so many important themes of Jesus Christ's incarnation, his mission, and reflections upon the church as a whole. One thing I really appreciated about the Passion of the Christ, more than any other Jesus film I've seen, I'm thinking of the old Jesus of Nazareth, I'm thinking of the Son of God movie that came out, is just that, I don't know, there must have been something going on with Jim Caviezel, who acted Jesus. He just presented him in such a good human way, but without negating his divinity. You saw subtle hints of his divinity throughout. Where sometimes I have such a hard issue with Jesus of Nazareth, where he just seems almost like in my personal opinion, don't get riled, just almost like this blue-eyed hippie staring off into the air, I never related to that as a kid. But this Jesus Christ who flicks water playfully on his mother from time to time, or is reminiscing almost on his gatherings with his disciples, at the breaking of the bread at the Last Supper. This is something that is just wonderful. It's a playful image of Jesus that I think it's wonderful to see that mirth, that joyousness and that subtlety in Jesus' character that I haven't seen before.
I think there's that sense of the milk of the Beatitudes, which comes out very clearly in a film like Jesus of Nazareth. But we need the blood of the Passion, the wine that became blood. And I think that's a work of God, but so grounded in the humanity. It calls to mind, as you're speaking, it calls to mind the quote that you express. Is that Bonaventure that said, in reflecting on Christ to, in a sense, bracket his divinity and focus on his humanity so we can come to understand the depth of the sacrifice that was made for us by God?
Yeah, and that's a paraphrase, not a direct quote, but I learned that from Bonaventure. He did that with, he wrote a whole section of a book on the Passion of Jesus Christ. And it begins with that kind of spiritual principle. You bracket his divinity not so much to get rid of it. It's more to...
It's not a negation.
It's not a negation.
Yeah, it's just a focus.
It's just, sometimes we can have a fairly monophysite or, dare I say, not human view of Jesus, but he was the incarnation. He was fully human, fully divine. As Catholics, we take that very seriously. And if you look at his humanity, and then return to the full picture, you see something deeper about the divinity. Sometimes we can think that Jesus was so divine that we lose his humanity a bit. It's just he never dealt with that issue. Well, step into the desert, whenever he's being tempted by Satan. He was dealing with very real human temptations, very real starvation. It's not as if he was getting this divine sedative when he was up on the cross. In fact, his wine was mixed with possibly a sedative earlier on and was offered to him, and he refused it. So this is a God who wants us to take him very seriously in this. So when you actually look about the Passion of the Christ and see his divinity, that's great. Almost put it aside and then allow the humanity of Jesus to challenge you and to comfort you, to console you, to disturb you at times. And it is disturbing,
It is definitely a very brutal film. It is not family viewing. Because the images are so startling. And yet I think you hit the nail on the head. Excuse the pun.
That's terrible.
So that was unintended. Kind of halfway through, I realized what that was. Sorry, let me rephrase that.
What a thorny.
You're
thorny
on the.
point.
I got myself into a thorny situation. Let's stop with that. Anyway, the point being, the emphasis on the humanity, I think, is what really comes out clearly in the Passion of the Christ. And I know when I'm viewing it, and I view it each year at this time of year, and the ability to really come and allow the human suffering that God endured for me to really hit home. It's startling.
He allowed every nerve in his body to feel everything.
It's startling, yeah. So certainly a brutal film. By the same token, also a beautiful film in that it leaves you in a place of very, very deep contemplation. At least it does me.
Yeah.
I strive to approach the film in a mode of meditation.
What's one of your favorite points in that film?
Well, I think the favorite point for me is when Mary is rushing to him in the Via Crucis, and when Christ is carrying the cross, and she can't go. She asks John to take her to him, and then she gets so far, and she's almost trapped by her humanity. This is a bit of kind of a strange juxtaposition to what you're doing, but blocked by her sorrow, but then sees deeper. We were just speaking about these conflicting emotions, these apparently conflicting emotions, but there is something that transcends the sorrow, and she's blocked by her sorrow, by her horror, and yet when she sees the humanity of her son, as her son, when he falls, it's her maternal nature. I want to say instinct, but it's deeper than instinct. It's that heart that she rushes to him, and that flashback to him being a little child, and that incredible maternal nature. And for me, that's an icon when I realize this portrayal of Mary, the Mother of God, is an icon of the mother that Mary is to me. That when I fall, that's what I need. So.
Beautiful, just beautiful. No, and then whenever Jesus actually takes strength from his mother in that moment and says to her, "Behold, see, mother, I make all things new." And there's that wonderful scene whenever Jesus lifts the cross and hugs it tenderly. And, the tender Jesus is one that I still go through a bit of emotional and spiritual adjustment to. I'm young, and I'm a young man. I've got my problems. But that one scene has always appealed to me, and without fail, it moves me to tears. And I'm not a tearful guy. I don't cry very often. Cry. Oh, I'm sure you could make me cry, but not
move you to tears. That's a whole other thing.
No. Whether you can induce tears or you can cause tears, maybe some distinctions here.
Yeah. Well, certainly, in that scene is the scene that always moves me to tears as well, and it is the tenderness. Our Lady of Tenderness. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
No, I think it's a wonderful film.
So do we have a suggestion for our next film? Maybe a little bit harder to track down, but I think we've decided that we're going to be unafraid of suggesting films that may be a little hard to track down. We'll always keep an eye on Netflix, Amazon Prime, what's available, but this may be one that that you actually have to be a little more intentional and invested in making a part of your collection.
And I think it's worth adding onto the digital bookshelf. This one's called Rudy, and it stars Samwise Gamgee.
Sean Astin.
Sean Astin,
yeah. Before he was a hobbit, he was a football player. Anyway, so yeah.
He was just as short, though.
And on a quest.
Yeah, on a quest, mission thing. Yeah, exactly. No,
in any case, yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful film. Hope you guys like it whenever you watch it. I just found it. He's just such a funny character in that film. He's just so likable, but he's also so annoying. But he's human, is what he is. And we'll talk more about it for next time. But
I think so. Just some priceless lines in there, but ultimately it's just about coming up against one's weaknesses and limitations and not being limited by one's weakness. And
it's a true story.
And based on a true story.
And it's based on a true
story. It's an older film, but definitely worth viewing. So Rudy.
And it's about football and Notre Dame, as they say in South Bend, Indiana.
Notre Dame.
So if you like those two things, then that's great. If you don't like those two things, well, think of Our Lady and think of soccer. We'll go English.
And
I don't know.
Samwise Gamgee.
Samwise Gamgee. That's right. Made in the Shire.
Beautiful. Right on. So I was interested in your thoughts on the subject, Nick.
And now it's time for the part of the show where Jim and Nick take on questions from our listeners. Okay, so I guess you went first last time, so I may as well just ask you one first. That sounds good. Okay, so serious or silly? Or in between? You know what? Here's one that might tie into just what to do with your free time in this time period. Coming from Christian Bacole, hey, he's in the room with us. Shout out. What is your favorite dish to cook? And please paint us a word picture of said dish.
Ooh, of said dish. My favorite dish to cook. Oh, that is a hard question.
Mm-hmm. And then you've got to paint a word picture of it. Maybe that's the easier part for you.
Well, I would think that it really depends on who you're going to be eating with, because of course the meal is going to be prepared for the company.
I thought you were going to say who you're going to be eating.
Well, there's always that too. No.
Fred the bowl. I'm just kidding.
So no, we're wanting to say, all right. So who are we cooking for? So, and if a meal that I would cook very simply, a simple one is a good stir fry. A nice beef stir fry, thinly sliced and sizzling, in my cast iron wok. Good heat, good, nice coconut oil in there.
Do I hear some jazz in the background?
A little bit of Nora Jones would probably be a good one to be playing there. Thinly sliced, get it sizzling hot, the onions in there, get them caramelizing, some red peppers, some yellow peppers, some mushrooms, nice cremini mushrooms, there's a baby portobello's nice, good texture
do
to
I
that.
smell or taste some red wine in the background?
A handful of cashews. Oh yeah, always a glass of red wine on hand. Handful of cashews, and you let that just cook and sizzle for a little bit. A little bit of cumin, a little bit of red pepper in there, just to give it a bit of zing. And then I would make a sauce for it. It's got some basmati rice cooking on the back as well, and usually you can do your frying in the same time that basmati rice is going. A little bit of turmeric in the rice, just give it some nice yellow, some color and a bit of flavor. And then you'd mix up a tablespoon or so of cornstarch with some orange juice or mango juice, and that's the sauce. And you have kind of some ginger and a bit of garlic, and you've got kind of nice orange ginger beef thing happening. Cooked quick, and then you're down to the main business of eating, which is really what cooking is all about. So, yeah, that would be a dish I would do.
Well, suddenly I'm realizing I'm very hungry. So
that's a good thing.
Thanks
all right,
for that. Yeah.
Maybe there's a little bit more word picture detail than you needed. He gave you the recipe as well. Anyway, here's one for you, Nick, coming from Natalie Godin. Have you discerned any charisms, and what might they be?
Oh, well, that's kind of interesting, considering some of our conversation today.
I know you mentioned knowledge earlier.
Yeah, and to tell you the truth, my discernment of charisms has been more like listening to what others have had to say, and I haven't really dedicated any strict prayer time to really knowing these things. It's more, for me, these are more loosely held than anything else. So one that I think I probably have, I'm not sure I would have survived without it, is a charism of teaching. I think that if I don't think I could have survived teaching here the last 2 years without that. I wish I could say it was all up to talent, but whatever. Charism of knowledge, I've just always loved study, and it's always come alive whenever it's in a communal context, I find. Sometimes I try to study in my spare time, and it just doesn't work. And then other than that, I've questioned hospitality. I've interrogated hospitality, just realizing the way I put that there. I'm not sure if I've really thought of anything else. I know I'm charismatic. I'm also conceited. I'll stop there.
Yeah, fair enough.
Cool. Well, okay, maybe another one for you there, Jim. Okay, here's one from Christina Denis. And this may very well be another podcast sometime. Let me know your thoughts. Has technology gone too far? What is the line?
Ooh, has technology gone too far?
Dun, dun, dun.
I guess that begs the question, what do we mean by too far?
Too far, and what is technology? Yeah. What is? I'm just.
I think that actually technology is a beautiful part of the created order. I think Pope Francis speaks about this too. That's part of our exercise of creativity. I think we need to be careful, though, that without a clear understanding of things being in service of the human person, then yes, technology can go too far. If it's not in service of the human person, and basically recognizing that just because it can be done does not mean that it should be done. So I think there needs to be some ethical structure. But I think you make a good point. I think that would be a wonderful conversation for us to have. So maybe we'll put a pin in that one and hang on. In the meantime, I have a burning question for you, Nick. Over the past couple of years, Christian Bacoli says, I have grown a deeper appreciation for good coffee. How do I say no to a bad cup of coffee without coming off as snobbish? On one hand, I don't want to offend my friend. On the other, at what point is self-annihilation worth the cost of pleasing others? Please help. And I think this is a beautiful question for you, Nick, because I know how much you love coffee.
Well, my next question is actually for Christian, which is this regarding my coffee? Yeah, no wonder you just started making your own.
It might just be. I think that's the coffee we're talking about.
Might just be. MJB.
Anyway, sorry.
The infamous MJB.
Product. That would be product displacement.
Yeah,
but anyway.
Product displacement. It's also poor advertising for St. Therese, unfortunately. Don't worry, that's gone now. We've moved to some more adequate stuff. The gracious art of the denying an inferior coffee. I must admit, this is a discipline, an art form, a leisure that I'm still developing. But I think a good deal of it has to do with feigning a washroom visit. But for real, I think it comes down to, for some reason that coffee's too acidic for me. Just being honest,
But that is actually less than honest. Oh, that's too acidic for me. Or I'm feeling that. You might as well be saying, I'm just fasting today. Really? Duplicity. I don't know.
I think, I don't know. I'm still figuring that one out. I tend to be a little too apologetic for my coffee snobbery. But I don't like the term snobbery. I don't even really know what to think of it as. So Christian might actually be teaching me a moral lesson here inadvertently. I'm not sure.
Somebody posted in the coffee room, a bad cup of coffee is better than no cup of coffee.
I disagree.
I would beg to differ. Anyway.
James, our cameraman, put that one up there. I know. But if it was between drinking a good cup of coffee and not, I think I'd just go for tea.
Tea.
I think I'd just go for tea.
Good.
I'm not a tea snob, so that's fine.
There you are.
Yep.
There we are.
Oh, let's see, what's our time here? Maybe one more question for you, Jim. Okay. From Maxime Champagne, what prompted you to choose the topic of angels for your MA thesis?
Well, it was not my MA thesis. It was actually my senior thesis in undergraduate, minor detail. But what prompted me to choose the study of angels was just a very deep interest in angels. I was doing a lot of reading on angels, a lot of discovery of angels, and so it just made sense. At that time, it was what was clearly on my radar screen. I was writing about it. In spiritual direction, I'd been encouraged to develop a relationship with my guardian angel, and I was just fascinated at the time, so it made perfect sense that's what I would do some deeper research in. So I did, on a classical angelology of the church. I very much enjoyed it. It was good.
I think I'd like to read that someday.
Yeah, I think I have a copy of it somewhere.
Cool. I'll give you my thesis in the meantime. We'll tell you what, we'll read it at the same pace.
Very good. All right, question for you. Last one. This is a bit more of a serious one, too. This is coming from Veronica Scubin.
Okay.
As Catholics, we do not believe in scattering ashes. Why does the Church allow relics of the saints, for example, pieces of bones, to be distributed all over the world? It's a good question.
Mm-hmm. That is a good one. And to tell you the truth, I'm still kind of coming to understand it a little deeper myself. So really what I can do is spitball. But I think that the reason we generally don't scatter ashes, and the reason why we have relics are actually part of the same thing. I think it comes from deep veneration of the body. Both things. It's important to realize that a deceased body is not quite the same thing as a fully living, active body, first off. So there is some different treatment. We don't bury alive bodies, for one. We bury dead bodies. So there's automatically, even in that tiny example, we don't bury people alive.
Much as we're tempted sometimes.
Well, as much as we're tempted
one
to.
Does not.
One does not simply, yeah. But I think even in that very thing, we're recognizing that something different has happened. But the thing is that Catholicism does have this view of the body which is very elevated. It's not just like this notion of the body being a cage or this discarded almost fecal matter or something like, you know, it's not like that. So with the reason why we don't usually scatter ashes is out of profound respect for the body, you know, out of respecting its integrity and all the rest. The reason why we have relics, I think, is actually also out of a profound respect for the body and the connection to, they're still in some way kind of connected to that person that was there. It's not just left. It's still, that body is still part of them in some manner. And so these relics become channels of grace. You know, much like the saint was a channel of grace in their day, they continue in this after death. And Saint Therese of Lisieux, I think, beautifully said, you know, I'm only going to get more busy when I enter into heaven. And you even have something of the truth of the body being demonstrated even in those incorruptible saints.
Yes.
So I think it's the same reason. The exact working out metaphysically of why this, why that, I'm still kind of hazy on. I'd be interested more to see what your response on this, Jim.
Well, I think that you start off and answer very beautifully that it is first and foremost about respect for this body. But that is also in token of the general resurrection of the dead. And the church teaching that it is actually this body. In what form? Hard to know. The Catechism says we will have a spiritual body, which seems a bit of an oxymoron, because how do you have a body which is physical, which is spiritual? Physical and spiritual, but it's a spiritual body. That's what we're taught. So that's all part of the mystery, how that's going to come about. The reason for the church, or one of the big reasons for the church in the past of being concerned about cremation, concerned about ashes, although it certainly has changed the understanding, but it's important that there be the reservation of the remains in consecrated ground. So grandma in an urn on your family, you know, mantle is maybe okay for veneration and respect and regard for generation, but what happens to grandma's remains after that? Because grandma's remains are important. So the idea of actually in a burial spot, in consecrated ground, is about being in token of the general resurrection of the dead. That this stuff matters. That's the beautiful thing about our Catholic faith, is stuff matters.
Yeah, we're a deeply
Matter
incarnational
matters.
religion. Yeah.
So the veneration of the saints, the fact of the matter is the relics that are going out is a foretaste of that communion of saints and the general resurrection of the dead. So we venerate the saints in their relic form, but there's that deep veneration. What is an important thing to recognize is that where there are relics, they need to be cared for carefully. And that's been a bit of a sad thing in recent times, is there's a lot of relics that are not being venerated and a lot of relics that are not actually being cared for. So if you are in the unique situation of actually having relics,
care for it.
Then yes, that's actually a spiritual treasure that needs to be cared for and venerated and treated with deep respect and reverence.
Yeah, this is not just something you carry in your pocket and throw on the table with your keys, kind of thing. It's not. It's not. You don't treat it quite like that. This is a channel of grace. This is it's connected to that person, their charism. You know, all that.
And it's about respect for the communion of the saints.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good answer.
Beautiful.
I have my own questions about the general resurrection of the body, but maybe that's another
conversation.
You know. So I guess it comes down to
who gets
the last
word. Rock, paper, scissors.
You're always getting the last word. Okay.
I'm sorry, Nick.
I'm just being gracious.
That's all right. So I want to thank you very much for joining us again. Nick, thanks. It was a great conversation. I enjoyed that one.
My pleasure.
And, a very happy Easter to all. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Stay in touch. Certainly be in our prayers. Thanks, Nick. Thank you all.